Hello, everybody. Today I'll be speaking with Carrick Flynn. Carrick ran for the Democratic nomination for Oregon's 6th congressional district, finishing second out of 9 candidates. Previously, he was a research fellow at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, focused on national security and technology law and AI policy. Before that, he served as the founding assistant director of the Center for Governance of AI at the University of Oxford. He's also lived and worked in public interest organizations in a variety of countries in South and Southeast Asia and Africa. Before we get into the interview, I should probably note that I actually supported Carrick's campaign for Congress, and I also donated to it. I intend this interview to be, neutral, and he's not running anymore, so I'm not trying to puff him up, but people should be aware of that for context. Okay, well, welcome to the show, Carrick.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So I guess, first of all, I'd like to talk about your candidacy for the Democratic primary in Oregon's 6th congressional district, right?
Yeah.
First of all, what was that like?
It was wild. It was a lot crazier than I was expecting going in, and there's a lot more variety of it in terms of very different things coming at you every single day. There was never a routine. There was never any sort of habit you could get into. There was always some new thing, some new crisis, somebody new to talk to from a very different angle. So it was very varied, long hours, like 16, 18-hour days. It had some nice bits. It was actually kind of nice to knock on doors and get to meet people and get ideas from a huge variety of people what they care about. But no, it was wild.
Okay, cool. And you ended up coming second in that race to, I guess, Andreas Salinas.
Yeah.
How surprised were you by that result? Partially you coming second, and partially which opponent ended up winning.
So Andreas Salinas was the one I expected. She was the leading candidate. I actually expected her to win at almost every point in the race.
Okay.
So I went in thinking I had 15, 20% chance, which, is low, but, small probability of something you could do really well. It seems worth it.
Sure.
And then throughout the races, things got better and we were doing internal surveys. There was a point sort of in the middle where I thought more likely than not I would win. Didn't last that long.
Yeah.
And then there was sort of a media pile on, after which more surveys and stuff and it was lower down. So by the time of the election, I was 30% that I would win. So I wasn't surprised when I lost. I will say it was sad. It was one of those things I geared up for it. I thought I knew it was going to come. But when it actually does hit, I think it's because you have so many people investing so much in you. You feel like there's this huge army of people behind you. And then, it was and then it didn't work, But it was incredible. And I have to say, all the people came up volunteering and stuff. That was amazing. And also all the great donors. Thank you.
I guess... I think I probably will have, by the time this episode has gone out, put a disclaimer at the start that I'm a donor to the Carrick Flynn campaign. So listeners should be aware of that.
I actually enjoyed because we had a talk somewhere in the beginning, or actually kind of near the beginning of the campaign, about probabilities under certain contingencies. And I remember at some point we talked for a second, and then we were going to do a callback. And in between, I sit down a piece of paper and I tried to work it out for myself, which I hadn't really done before. And it was actually kind of a useful exercise. And then I came back, I'm like, okay, here's what I think under the following contingencies.
Okay, what did you? What did the process of working out on paper look like? What were the, I guess, important factors that went into that calculation?
Part of it was thinking in terms of the poll numbers, obviously, that I'd seen. But also there's numbers on, what probability you have of winning if you're able to outraise a candidate, things like that as going in. Because we were just, a regular fundraising, we outraised all other candidates combined. It was... there was a groundswell of support that was really amazing.
Okay.
And we had there's independent advocacy groups that had television ads, which are very effective, or certainly at volume. And at the same time, everyone else had not been able to fundraise to the extent where they wouldn't really have very many advertisements. So I thought it might, that was part of the process, or part of the thought process.
Okay. And I guess related to that, is there anything you feel like you've learned from running that, any big takeaways you have?
I have a lot of big takeaways. I think one sort of sad thing is I kind of came in with this understanding that politics was pretty gross, already. And I think having seen it up close, it was grosser still than I expected. And I didn't think I could go lower in my opinion of it. But there's almost no one involved in politics who was trying to seek the truth. And it was like this sort of like very serious disregard. It wasn't necessarily that they were lying; they just didn't care, right? It was like the things they said didn't have to correspond with anything. Um, that was really bad. Some of the consultants were more or less like con artists, and then, there's like whole like layer and layer. There's sort of apparatus of people who have their own agenda who will sling mud at you. There was some of the dirty politicking was pretty disgusting in terms of people impersonating me online to make me look bad. Just like things like this that were absolutely terrible. But on the other hand, what I also learned is if you go in there and if you're going in there and you're serious about policy and you're like sincere, when you talk to people, when you get a chance to actually like face to face talk to people, or talk to sort of groups, they can kind of tell actually. And I was able to get a lot of support locally by just meaning it, I think, because it doesn't, it does sound different. The problem was with limited time, I wasn't able to get to enough people. I think that was part of it. But there's I think the other takeaways, it's a strange process. It's like politics is very odd.
Odd in the ways you've mentioned, or do you have other
ways in which it's odd? Hope you can edit out pauses.
Yeah.
Probably not stuff I should mention.
Okay. Yeah. I guess, yeah. So in terms of like speaking face to face to people, I think one thing that was notable about your campaign is you had like a high volume of like PAC spending relative to campaign spending. At least is my understanding of that. And I think I had the impression that in PAC spending, like you couldn't be talking in it. I'm wondering, do you think that was like a serious limitation? Or do you think like actually in person is just way better than you talking on TV?
I think, well, the thing is like if you have an actual message and you have the substance in it, you can't reach anyone unless you do TV to some extent, because most voters don't have time, and I think this is fair, to like seek out information on every candidate and read like in detail. It's like there's a lot of process. So getting some amount of impression, if you're talking about real policy positions and like sincere background, is quite useful. I think the TV spending, people did comment it was weird to not hear my voice. At some point, I think there was an ad that took a video of me talking about something else, or talking not for an ad, but I was doing some other talking, and they were able to use some portion of me speaking about something else in a different context and put it over. But I didn't realize that was okay until it happened, or maybe it wasn't okay and somebody's going to get in trouble. I don't know.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I guess related to that, you're sort of connected to this like effective altruist community that like, maybe other people in that community would be interested in running. Also, I think like a lot of people in the effective altruist community are sort of somehow connected to the tech world. And I think like one critique of your campaign was that like to some degree, at least in funding, you had these like, you had some kinds of tech connections, and there were some implications that like that was a bad thing. How big of a problem do you think that might be for other people who might run in similar circumstances?
In terms of perception, it's probably somewhat bad. There's this interesting thing where there's like some groups or affiliations that if you get tied to them, it's like dramatically bad. So in my case, actually, the thing that mostly happened was they tied me to like crypto stuff. Which actually really is swing and a miss. I have nothing to do with crypto at all. Okay. But it was this thing where it became this like, oh, he's like a crypto candidate. And the crypto sounds bad, and it's like a bad thing, and anyone does it is bad. And I think if you do tech, there's also this association of sort of like the dirty tech bro. I think there's a different thing. Like I tried to explain several times. Oh, I also was involved. I helped found the Center for the Governance of AI. Yep. And a lot of people are like, oh, so you're one of these guys who wants to like automate away our jobs. I'm like, no, kind of the opposite, actually. Center for the Governance of AI. Okay. Yeah, so I think that association's bad. How serious will it be? I think you can overcome things like that. I think if the fundamentals are good, a lot of people who are fans of effective altruism are really nice people, sincere. They have a track record showing that they really care, sincerely care, and also that they take policy seriously. They're not making it up. They're being rigorous. They're looking at the evidence base. And I think that can overwhelm a lot of the other things. But I don't know. I will say, like, since the campaign and even like after the campaign, I've had like a flood of people coming at me, thinking about running. They want my advice and stuff. And it's amazing. It seems like there might be sort of a wave of people who, care about, the scale of things in terms of scope sensitivity. They care about cause prioritization in terms of, what we can get done and like all of these things who actually get into these positions. And I think that'll be, if it works, that'll be absolutely amazing. So if I helped bring that about, like, it makes it all worth it, certainly.
Okay. And yeah, speaking of like other EAs potentially running, do you think like you have a future in political stuff?
I'm not planning on running anytime soon. I could see doing it again in maybe like 10 years or something. I think I could see being involved in helping other people run because I do think there is a real opportunity here to make actually quite a large difference if you can get into Congress, based on my other experience working with Congress. And yeah, if we could get anyone actually, or if anyone got into the position who was like serious about it, I'd love to sort of help or like help them get elected. But no, I'm definitely going to at least take a break from politics.
Okay. What are you going to do in the meantime?
Yeah, I'm sort of. So my career has been this really odd, random, or it looks random. It makes sense to me. This kind of walk through space, like these like weird jobs. And this is something where I would talk to journalists, and they were like, "What have you done? Like, I don't understand. Like, why have all these things come together?" And the thread that like is invisible, but it's there, is I've always tried to do as much like good as I can. So, I started out doing like economic development work in Africa, then I moved on to like emerging technology stuff because of, trying to get leverage there. Started working in DC on like pandemic stuff. And then, tried to get into office. And it all makes sense when you view it that way. It's like me trying to figure out what makes, where I can do the best good, the most good. And so the next step is like, where can I, with the skill sets I've developed, the lessons I've learned from running, where can I do the most good? And I'm not sure. So I'm kind of taking a little bit of time to explore. I've been able to, before I ran, I was doing consulting for a couple groups. They were happy to pick me up again. So I have like a good steady income. And so I have some time to like figure things out before I like settle in like a more permanent job.
Okay. Yeah. Now, I guess I'd like to move on to what I perceive as the signature issue of your campaign, or at least like the issue which differentiated you the most from other candidates, which was pandemic policy.
Yep.
I think, yeah. So in your ads, like there was a sense that like you had some ideas of like things that Congress could do that would prevent many or most pandemics. Hopefully, I'm not misstating that.
No.
What would that be?
So there was a thing. I'll go back a little far. So after COVID broke out, it was basically Andrew Snyder-Beatty who does what's his title? It's like. But part of what he does is for his job is like pandemic prevention stuff, and he's been doing this for years and years. So what he did is he went and like tried to find a team of people he thought could like push through something in Congress that would make this obsolete. And he has a sort of like strong tech background in terms of like what you can do with technology to prevent pandemics.
Okay.
So there was a gathering of like 125 of the world's best experts. They put in all their recommendations, worked it out. Became a set of recommendations, and then the team I was sort of brought in on was like take these recommendations and make them policy like digestible, so we can move them forward, and then try and like kind of sell them. And so we did. We tried to sell them in Congress, and it didn't really work. But we also tried to sell them to the White House, and it worked very well. So this became the stuff we wrote up became like Biden's pandemic prevention plan, and that's a thing that was actually in the first infrastructure bill. I got removed before the second infrastructure bill. For cost savings, which is like one of those things that like makes you want to tear your hair out. It's like a $30 billion bill, and like the pandemic cost like $16 trillion.
Sorry, the $30 billion, was that the whole infrastructure bill, or was that the pandemic portion?
That's pandemic portion. The whole infrastructure bill is like, sorry, this is not the right number, but it's something like 2 or 3 trillion. It was absolutely enormous, and it got whittled down to like 1 trillion. And in that, like the pandemic prevention was a part of what got cut, and now it still exists, and it bounces around in Congress and every once in a while. Like I have a Google alert for it. Like something will happen, but it's still sort of like it's not going forward.
Okay.
And the plan is really good actually, and I think it would prevent almost all pandemics. So the first step is like you can call it like ubiquitous detection. So you get a lot of DNA sequencers and testing kits, and that are very cheap, and they're getting actually very cheap. The DNA sequencers have been on this kind of Moore's law like trajectory, such that they're at some point they'll be. I know it'd be like having a printer or something. It's like not that big a deal to have. And they're basically at the point already where you could, afford to like have a USAID, like put them out in like rural hospitals in Africa, like cost effectively. And whenever someone comes in with, some like pneumonia-like illness or something like this that's like difficult to detect, you sequence it and you see if it's something new. It's also helpful medically if you figure out it's just an old thing that you didn't expect. And as soon as you see something's new, then the next step is containment. And how you contain it is the key to really good containment is like really good next generation personal protective equipment, because that ensures that people like first responders, police, paramedics, these folks, can go in and actually contain the area safely. Like literally, just go in and change and make sure that they're not themselves spreading it. Very powerful tool. The next step is next generation vaccines. These are the ones that work sort of like a ratchet in a socket, where the main vaccine already exists. You just print out the little bit that is like the payload at the end that's unique, and you put them in. I was talking to one of the a brilliant manufacturer of these things, and he says, if you give me a DNA sequence in 8 days, I can put it in your arm. He's like, I can put one in your arm because all he does is makes the small version. He's like, well, then you have to go then it has to go and get bulked up, which is a different process he wasn't involved in. But these things normally in the past take years. And even the really fast one for COVID took, I think, over a year. So if you can imagine this thing where, you circle the people are contagious as best you can. And then you vaccinate everyone in the area. And then it's over. It's not even a story.
Okay.
And there's a precedent for this. There was a smallpox outbreak sometime in, I think, the 1970s in New York. And what they did was they just vaccinated 30 million people.
Okay.
They just vaccinated the whole East Coast and it was dead. And then the third part of this was slightly tangential, but very important, which is lab security. Because we do have people like the anthrax letter terrorist. We have, accidents and leaks that happen actually pretty frequently when you look at them. And we have all the most dangerous pathogens in the world stored in these labs. So we need to get very good at locking these down. So in my head, the analogy I like is thinking of it as a forest fire. It's when the first smoke arises, what you want is the detection towers. And these are this ubiquitous sequencing. Okay, we see it now, we know where to go. Then you send in the firefighters. These are the PPE. They dig the trenches. Now it's somewhat contained. And then the vaccine comes in and it's, the fire retardant plane that just drops it in and it's gone completely. And then I think the laboratory component is not setting off fireworks in July in the forest.
Okay. So I actually want to ask a bunch of questions about that about the individual components. So first, I guess the first step was DNA sequencing in a bunch of places. So concretely, is the idea that the federal government just buys a bunch of these kits and sends them to places, or do they pay for more R&D on the technology? Or
part of it was paying for more R&D. Part of it was actually a lot of it was R&D, and some of it was sending it out for detection. There's actually already programs where these sequencers they're more expensive and they're rarer, but some of these sequencers in the old generation are in different places. It was actually one of these sequencers. It was from one of these American companies who now makes a really cheap model. It was one of their older, more expensive models that first figured out that COVID was something different, but that took, I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact number. It's something on the order of 45 days.
Okay.
And now if you have this thing in the hospital in Wuhan, it's whoa, that's a weird pneumonia. Next day, it's, and I had the person, one of the people I was working with who, got a background in this, calculated it out. And he says, based on the speed of reproduction and contagion of COVID, basically, it's on, it would be November 24th, whatever the date was, we'll know it's here. We contain it in these places, which would actually have done it if we got the Wuhan market and the initial hospital. And he's and then we have vaccines enough for that area. He's by mid-December. And then it's not, America never even has this one news article about it because it was such a non-event. And he's that's the timeline we would be on. And the reason I say it works against almost all pandemics is there are pandemics that are extremely contagious, not COVID, but really, really contagious, where you just have to hope they don't happen because there's probably no way to stop them. And then hopefully you get enough vaccines quickly enough that you can prevent some people from getting it. But there's some really dangerous stuff out there.
And part of this plan was I guess you had to have the DNA sequencing in tons of places, almost everywhere. How widely, if the U.S. government is funding them, well, I could totally see a world in which the U.S. government gives I don't know, every hospital in the U.S. and tons of buildings their own DNA sequencer. But presumably it would have to be global, right? So do we just send a bunch of boxes to China with notes that say, this is definitely a machine that only does DNA sequencing? Or
they're probably made in China, right?
Okay.
Well, because I think the idea was mostly for the developed countries. They just buy their own. Because again, if it's $200 and it's like pretty good. You can just use it diagnostically because if someone comes with weird symptoms, sometimes it's just good to know what they have because there's some things that initially present the same way that are different illnesses and you want to treat differently. And for that, I think that's like the cost of like a cup of water in the emergency room or something, right? Like it's not that much money. And places like in Africa, certainly in like a a lot of Southeast Asia, I think it would be sort of bundled in with these these existing like pandemic prevention programs. And might not even cost that much more money, or it might even be cheaper if you need fewer people playing this role because the sequencer can do it.
Okay, so I should imagine some combination of like sending it to places, maybe with like maybe as part of aid packages, and also like why aren't they buying them already in first world countries? Like, are the kits not cheap enough, and the R&D in the bill would make them cheaper? Or
yeah, they're quite cheap now, and they are being bought a lot of places. This is one of these things where it's kind of a slow rollout, and it's a little bit. Reading up on some of these people who market these, and they say you go to a hospital administrator, and you're like, "Oh, it's sequence is a thing," and they're like, "Why would I do that?" Like it's like I'm close enough in knowing what the disease is. I don't need to treat it further. Like if they have pneumonia, I'm just going to do this thing. Kind of like they just didn't see why they needed it medically, which I think was wrong actually in terms of there's enough differentiation and it's sufficiently cheap, or would be sufficiently cheap. It is very cheap now. It's not as cheap as we think we can get it with relatively little investment. That was the sort of other thing. You can see realistically that it's a couple Moore's law halving or whatever away from being like very cheap. And there's some research being done on like how you do the sequencing that isn't quite mature, but that could be brought online very quickly.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So the next step was basically investing in what you described as next generation PPE in order to like contain cases or like make sure that doctors didn't also get infected. Could you say a bit more about what that looks like? For instance, what is next generation PPE?
Yeah, so some of it is actually about being cheaper while having the similar protective properties because the really amazing sort of protective suits you see in like hazmat teams, those are normally like over $1,000. Whereas you can get almost as much coverage with these other get-ups that were, I think they were like 150. And if you look actually in China, the protection they were using in their COVID hospitals, which was actually 100% effective, once they knew what COVID was and they had the COVID hospitals, no doctor or nurse was ever infected. That was very cheap. I mean, in the order of like $150, $200. The other thing, and the thing I was trying to emphasize in the bill, was to try and get better like mask technology for the illnesses that are bad but not especially contagious. I'm thinking stuff like Ebola. You have time. Like when Ebola rolls out, you do have it's horrifying, but at least you have time to contain it or to find the vaccine. If you get something that's really contagious, you will have no time at all. It'll just burn through like everything. In which case, you're only, and these are always respiratory illnesses. That's the ones that spread quickly are always the respiratory illnesses. So if you had a mask thing that like actually worked, and other masks don't really work, that would go a long way towards preventing this. And a large part of that is actually having a seal along the outside. So the mask standards in the US are based on, this thing's one of those times that just drives you crazy. They have mask standards and differentiating like N95s, N99s, these things. And how they test them at the federal level is they glue the mask on a mannequin and then they do like a testing regime. And they know in advance that like more than 10% of the air comes in through the side. So is it a 95 or 99? It doesn't matter because 10% of the air is coming around the side. It's like, it doesn't, so having like a seal that actually works and like works under actual working conditions in terms of like moving different places and things would be good because they just discover things like while performing CPR, your mask doesn't work really because you're moving too much and breathing too hard. And all of these sorts of things. And it's also something where if you had, okay, so I'm going to go back a step. So measles is an incredible illness, and I mean that sort of in a bad way. It is so contagious. It has a reproductive factor of something like 16. So every person who gets it like infects 16 other people, and very quickly. And if you're completely unexposed to it, as in like if your grandparents haven't even seen it, so a complete new population, it kills something like about a third of all the people who get it. Now this thing is so contagious that when it got to Greenland. I'm sorry, I'm going to do this thing where the numbers are slightly wrong, but the gist is right. When it got to Greenland, There was something like 5,000 people in Greenland at the time, and it infected every person in Greenland except like 7 in like an order of months. And you think of Greenland, this is not like a city or something. You know, there's people kind of separate from each other in Greenland, and they still like it just got all of them, and there was like no stopping it. When it landed in, I think Fiji, obviously it killed something like a third of the population, but it also infected the whole thing. And like again, I think it was an order of like 2 or 3 months. So in that case, if you have this thing where you have these masks, and we know how to make these masks that are sort of like N95s and that they're relatively cheap, but they actually work. You can just like and you have these like in the strategic national stockpile, you can actually just give them out. You can mail them to people, and they actually maybe don't get it. You can actually potentially buy time that way, and a lot of time.
Okay. I'm wondering how... So, in terms of seals around the outside, should I... Like, what would that look like? Does that... So, I've seen some masks that have like a little, like, sort of circle, like foam strip, or maybe it's not exactly foam, that's like around the outside. Would it sort of be like that, or would I imagine something like harder? Or...
I think probably like that. I think actually you probably want it softer because like it sticks better. But there's interesting things where the variation within masks and how well they fit is absolutely enormous. Or sorry, how well they protect against this is absolutely enormous. So they've done studies, and there's some that like actually the normal one is something like 10% or less, and some of them have like 99.99 whatever, but they're marketed as the same mask. It's just like an N95.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where it's like if we have this variation, and we know we can do it because we have proof of concept. You can make these really good masks. We need to be able to like say, okay, you're a better mask. We're going to buy you. We're going to systemize you. You're going to become the new standard. This sort of thing. But I think it'd be more soft rubber. I think it would be a better testing regime and competition to figure out like what has these characteristics. And has these characteristics that's also like light and wearable, because there are some really good like full face masks, but
like the respirators, the like people who do painting use, that looks like kind of like a gas mask.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like what they wear in Breaking Bad with the full. Those are actually really good, especially if you have a good seal on that. It's amazingly effective. But you imagine like, oh, you have to wear that to the supermarket. It would be a hard sell.
I actually did wear that to a supermarket.
Really?
Yeah. I actually even I wore it on a flight once back when I was like really freaking out. But it's so so one thing is it looks very weird. Which I guess I just didn't mind looking weird. But another one is it just like after like 2 hours or something, it just like actually hurts your face. Or like maybe I wasn't adjusting it right or something.
No, it does. Yeah, it actually hurts. And if you look at like the doctors in China who are doing this stuff, they have these like really gnarly like bruises and stuff over time. And they're only wearing them like 4 hours at a time. But it's actually, and they're unpleasant. They get really humid often. I don't know if yours did, but like they get super humid inside.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and you can collect water at the bottom. It's like this thing where if you have something that's nicer, and they did a competition for masks that didn't have the same criteria as does it work. And they came up with these masks that had a lot more folds, so they had more surface area. It was basically a normal kind of white mask or whatever. But because it had more surface area, it had like no resistance.
Like
you
more
could just
gas
breathe in and out.
interchange.
Yeah, more gas interchange, but also because there's like you could breathe in and out without any resistance at all. You didn't push the corners off, so like the seal was much better. And there's little things like that where I think if you put some like prize on it, and then you have a bunch of these things come in, it would be great. And like, what can you do cheaply? I think this would be the best thing we could do for pandemic prevention. To be clear, that's my personal opinion. I think the team all thought that the DNA sequencing was more important, but
okay. And would this look more like? Would it just be doing some R&D and like acquiring like really like masks that seem like they work, or would also part of the vision be like getting NIOSH or someone to like have a different standard for like actually how much air goes in?
I think if you had NIOSH have a different standard, that'd be huge. I think what you could do is also use, if you had a competition, you could use that to ratchet up the standard. It's like we have masks that like hit the following like stats. So NIOSH says like, okay, if you want to be certified as this type of mask, you need to hit the standards of this. And then, people start opting in because they're better masks. I'm not sure if you like have to mandate it for a lot of things. The thing I would like a lot though is for this to be the thing that ends up in the strategic national stockpile. So again, if I'm just dreaming, what I would love to have is like a good competition with like pretty good criteria for like what actually works in a mask as well as like being usable. And then whoever wins the competition gets like the contract with the strategic national stockpile to like for like 50 million masks, because that's a very big reward in terms of profit. And then in like 3 years, you do it again. This way you have like a rolling stock, and whoever wins that one, goes in. And then we have the stockpile of like extremely effective masks.
Okay. And again, I guess the vision is like something like get masks and make them cheap, and like there's some of the strategic national stockpile, and also rich countries will buy them because they're cheap and they work, and you can like put them in aid for countries that can't afford them.
Yeah, if you look at like sort of old masks, even in the 80s, how masks were done were very different. And what happened is like at some point the N95s were just better. Like you get these like old round ones back in the day, like that were paper.
The like cardboard.
Yeah, it's like a circular cardboard one.
Yeah,
and it's
I've seen those here even.
They use them now.
I think here in the Bay Area, often there are fires in some bit of California, and the wind will like blow the smoke into the Bay Area for like a week or something.
Yeah. Happens in Portland too, in Oregon.
Yeah. And so I think when that was happening, I think I like pretty regularly saw people with these cardboardy style masks. I think less during the pandemic.
Yeah, I wonder if they got them from like one of these old stockpiles, because it's kind of like not a popular mask anymore. It's kind of considered just like strictly worse. And like N95s are just the thing with like the pinching nose. I think what would happen through time, if you have a better mask and it's like nice to breathe through, or maybe nicer to breathe through, if I'm just painting a house, that's what I'm going to do. Or like, if I'm stuck downwind of a forest fire, so that's just what I'm going to choose. And it's also going to be like, what once you have it mass produced, it's going to be what everyone chooses. So China will buy them, Europe's going to buy them. It's going to become the new standard. And then when something bad happens, we can actually, a very contagious respiratory thing, we can actually contain it. Like COVID, again, it was not actually that contagious. It was obviously contagious. It wasn't that contagious. And like everyone got it, right? And it was, if you think of that as sort of an indication of what we should watch out for when you have something much more contagious and potentially much more dangerous, we're in terrible shape. Again, if you just knew measles happened right now, you're going to lose probably something like a third of the world population, because we don't have any way of containing it at all, or treating it, or getting a vaccine for it. And it's so fast. And it's not make-believe, because measles exists. We know this is like a virus that can't exist.
Okay. Yeah. So in terms of the PPE, one thing I'm wondering is, I have this impression that part of the reason it was difficult to get masks was like a difficulty in scaling up production. I'm not sure if it was regulatory or just like logistical, but like my impression is that this is sort of why like for a while everyone was ending up with these KN95s rather than N95s, was because like you could buy them. You couldn't buy N95s. How big of a bottleneck? Do you think that that's a big bottleneck, and would the Biden plan alleviate that bottleneck?
The stuff that happened actually at the original, at the very beginning of COVID with masks is fascinating. And there's been like these sort of expose pieces on these. But what happened when it very first broke out in China is that there was a big move by one of the names of these groups, these kind of like Chinese societies in different countries, to gather all the local masks and send them back to China. And then there was like a goodwill gesture by the U.S. was where we sent like something like half of our strategic national stockpile of masks to China.
Okay.
Now, the strategic national stockpile of masks at that point was something like, again, not the right number, but something like 6 million. Okay. Now, it used to be something like 100 million. And what happened is we'd used it with the swine flu pandemic down, and then we didn't refill it. Which, again, if you've just used it, it's like the worst time to not refill something, because it's like proved its worth.
Yeah.
So that by the time we were done, like there was like nothing at all. The problem with production is that masks are used very little until they're used a lot. So that is kind of the type of product that naturally you want to stockpile. So you can kind of hum along producing some amount. And then like if you store it in the strategic national stockpile or wherever, when you need it, you can draw it down. There were things with the production line of, what's that thing called? There's this very interesting machine. It's like melt blown. Anyways, it's this machine that's used to make the filter. And this was the main, actually, I think it was like the only bottleneck really in the mass production. And there aren't that many of them. There's something like, again, on the order of like 10 of them in the US. There were a couple that were being kept by the federal government with a bit of foresight, I'll say, where they'll pay companies to sort of keep them alive in case they need them, which was good. But also in the chaos of it, there were a lot of them that had been kept warm, as in like usable, that were not used. Just normal sort of like everyone's freaking out, and like the person wasn't in contact, and so it didn't work, and this the contract, and China had a lot of these things. China started producing it. It scaled up very, very rapidly, and then by I don't remember when, but in the first year of the pandemic, they were supplying something like 90 or 95. I'm sorry, again, not exact number. Something like 90 or 95% of the world's masks, and something like 75 or 80% of the U.S.'s masks.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think having warm production facilities is good. I think having, hopefully, good international relationships with other countries. But I think a stockpile is really helpful, and especially in a very rapid scenario. So if you, again, measles, you can't make it in time for measles, but if you have it there, you can potentially spread it out or like mail it out.
Okay. What's the difference between like if China was able to ratchet up production of these masks, what did they have that the US didn't?
I think what they had was that they had quarantined effectively very early. They had used good PPE with doctors so that they weren't spreading it further. And then they basically stopped having cases. I mean, like if you look at China, they had this little spike and then they like stopped having cases. And so everyone went back to work and all the factories were full. Everything was humming. And now also there's this huge market opportunity. So everyone like jumped in on it. Whereas the US was like, we just were absolutely on our knees, especially for like the first year. It was, I mean, you guys remember, it was absolutely terrible. And we couldn't do anything. We could barely produce, there's all these agricultural things breaking down. Like the whole supply chains were getting damaged. So I think that was a lot of it. I think they maybe already had more of the melt blown. There's something other, it's like the melt blown machines, which also would have helped.
Okay. And yeah, it sort of sounds like a big part of this plan is like, or a big part of what you need to go well is like, if things get better early on, you have way fewer problems.
Yeah.
And partially I'm thinking like when you say like a national stockpile of 100 million masks, 1 per 3 people doesn't sound like enough for a year-long pandemic in the US. But if it's like, if you can squash it initially, it sounds like maybe enough to do that. Is that kind of the idea of?
Yeah, that's kind of I will say, like, the number I wanted was like over 1 billion, because that way, like, everyone can have 3 masks, something like that.
Okay.
There's also another version if you're, I mean, they don't want to pay for this and they're not paying for this, right? If they're kind of like not interested in paying for this, where you have some masks that are reusable. So instead of like the paper masks, you have the plastic masks, but you'd want a competition for these also that seal well and that are relatively comfortable, and probably half masks because they're more comfortable.
Yeah.
And then you give them out to 50 million essential workers. Everyone else stays home. The 50 million essential workers work. And then we wait till we have a vaccine, or like at least until we can ramp up production of the masks. It's just the thing where there's so little demand for masks the vast majority of time. It just seems to me very natural that it's the kind of thing you stockpile.
Okay.
Just when it's so uneven, right? Because it's not necessarily worth having the machines that can produce, billions of masks just kind of sitting around all the time.
Okay. I think that makes sense. I guess the next thing I want to talk about is, you mentioned next generation vaccines. Is that just referring to mRNA vaccines or something else?
mRNA is like one version of the next generation vaccine. There's another one that, oh man, what's it called? It's a similar design, but I think it has a more positive response, and it's also very quick to make. What's it called? There's a couple of these. Basically, it's the case that after this and after the success of mRNA, there's a billion grads, PhD students for like working on the next generation of these, and some are fantastic. So I think this is something that will work. It kind of does work already. Some of these ones, like even the experimental ones, on mice or whatever, work really well. And then it's getting it approved, which is going to take, I don't know, decades or whatever with the FDA. And then it's actually getting scale up and getting the ability to scale up in a large way, which again has to get approved. And I would say there's a little bit of a funding gap here for the research, but the larger problem is regulatory. That's like really what delays.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking this, I've heard that the first vaccine that Moderna produced was out. They made a thing you could put in one person's arm in January.
Yeah.
And then like in December, some other people get it. And yeah, as far as I can tell, the gap is in like how quickly you can satisfy FDA requirements. For, I guess, safety and efficacy for vaccines. Is that right?
Yeah, safety and efficacy. I think it's funny because it's not funny. There was a test that came out extremely early in the pandemic that could scale up well, and it had like something like an 85% false positive rate, and so they didn't approve it. And we didn't have other tests, and you're like, let's just have them take 3 tests. We need some tests. But yeah, I think that the approval process is a nightmare. Like you're saying, I think it was like the the first vaccine was produced within like something like under a week from when it was, the DNA sequence was released by one of these
Yeah.
machines. You kind of see like there was this thing that happened, which is they had one of these machines somewhere nearby, not as close as you want. It sequences it, and immediately you get this vaccine made. And like that's the process you want. And then the next step is you want these like facilities that can pump out huge numbers of vaccines.
Okay.
Which is its own logistical problem in that it has its own how do you keep these machines alive component. But
Yeah. And so if I'm thinking about specifically the Biden proposal, would that alleviate the constraint on like how much time it takes for these to get approved, or is it just like funding research into these types of vaccines?
that's a good point. I think it was mostly research and maybe some scale up capability, or like there's a thing you do a lot in bills where you sort of like commission the government to do a report on the feasibility of something.
Okay.
I don't really remember now if the regulatory part was also part of this bill, but it would be great if it was. I think maybe it wasn't just because you don't necessarily want to. We wanted it through, and so like maybe like make it uncomplicated and
Okay.
like politically neutral. So I would guess probably it wasn't. Um, I'm not sure what you can do with the regulatory thing. That feels like a heavy lift, unfortunately.
Yeah. If you can't do that, then how like suppose we have like most of this proposal, but there's no regulatory changes, and it continues to be the case that there's like, let's say there's like 9 months between like you have the ability to make the first dose of vaccine and you're allowed to like administer it en masse. Um, how effective is that in preventing pandemics?
I mean, against some pandemics, it's very effective, right? It's just the case of the really contagious ones that are really, really hard. I think the more contagious the thing is, it's the more, well, obviously contagious and lethal are the ones we really should focus on in particular,
Hmm.
because it's like, oh, if this were this very simple thing, we only need like 12 masks. It's like, don't plan for the easy case.
Yep.
That doesn't make any sense at all. What I'll say is I think maybe there's some hope that we'll have, I don't know, I'll call it like the Chernobyl effect. There was this person who like worked during the disaster of Chernobyl, and what he just described was how, for once, and he'd never seen it before, everyone was just working, doing what they should do. There was no ego. There was no like, it's not my job. There's none of this like normal sort of Soviet like bureaucracy. It was like everyone actually was taking it seriously and doing the job to do the job correctly. And I would have to hope that if there's like another pandemic like this, and maybe a worse one or more contagious one, then maybe you could actually get the FDA to be like, fine, just do it. And we by then would have the capabilities to do it.
Okay. But in the case of like, so if we don't have this the like rapid approval of vaccines, should I imagine that the response is roughly like you like are able to detect new diseases like pretty quickly with sequencing machines, and you like isolate patients very well and treat them, and just like treat them well enough and stop it spreading well enough via the PPE that hopefully you don't like need to vaccinate people super quickly. Is that roughly the idea?
Well, hopefully, okay. So hopefully, be able to vaccinate quickly. I will say one of the things with like the mRNA vaccines and the similar ones is that it's plausible. Some people think it's possibly the case you could get an approval for like the wrench, and then the sockets would be allowed to change. In which case, it could be the case that you actually could have like pre-approved vaccines where you like adapt it specifically to a different virus. I don't know. That's sort of hopeful, but like if that worked, it'd be good. I think with quarantine, like the point of the quarantine is to prevent spread. It'd be really good if you could treat people well. If you're depending on what you're talking about with disease, that might be terrible. Like I think the initial COVID quarantines were pretty terrible. Certainly, like the cruise ships ones were terrible. I don't know if you had a. I'm not sure what you do with the people who initially get it. Hopefully, you just try and keep them alive for long enough. But again, I always go to measles because it's the one that feels like in my mind. I'm like, let's have it so that a new measles we'd be able to contain that. That feels like the right mark. In that case, I don't think there'd be anything you could do. It's just so fast, except contain it. Yeah.
Okay. And sorry, when you say there's not anything you do, you mean like without rapid approval of vaccines?
For those who are quarantined, I'm not sure there's anything you could do at all.
Oh, okay.
I think they might be too sick too soon that like the vaccines wouldn't be applicable, and you just have to treat them.
Yep. Okay.
And you can vaccinate further around just in case there's like a leak.
Sure.
Or something. Yeah.
All right. So the fourth part of the plan was improving lab security. What would that concretely look like?
So there's actually a couple, I guess I'd say like professional lab security advocates who have very, very specific recommendations. And I'm not sure I followed all of them. But especially with like the level 4 stuff, some of the recommendations are, they go from like, I mean, very technical. It's like use this type of sealing, not this, like sealant or whatever, not this type. You need the air pressure at this, not at this. You need, there's some funny ones like they're really unintuitive until you hear them. Where it's like you need, so the rinse off thing, if you go in and out of one of these labs, BSL-4 labs, you have to get a rinse, like you through a shower, and like make the water warm because people are just going through there really quickly because they're doused in cold water. Make it warm so they stay and actually like make sure everything's like disinfected. And there's also things like putting, I don't know if they do this all the time, but they might, I know they already do this in tests where they put, what do I want to call it? So it's basically one of these invisible agents that you can't see while you're in the lab, but you know, if you put it under a UV light, you can see.
Okay.
So it's like you have people interact with a lot of things, and afterwards you see if it came out with them. And actually, those tests are not encouraging, like now. And I think you'd work back from there. I don't know that much about this, like the technical parts of this in particular.
Okay.
Do you know it's important? Again, one of these people I was working with was saying with SARS, like the original COVID vaccine in Hong Kong, that was way more lethal. There have been 5 outbreaks of SARS that were like independent of one another. 2 of them were natural, like it jumped twice to humans naturally, and 3 were from lab leaks or accidents. And so what he was saying was the natural habitat of sorry, how do you say it? It was like very pithy. The natural host of SARS is laboratories, and the vector is mistakes by workers. And that kind of shows how dangerous this is, especially because these things are everything that's the most dangerous in the world that we have are in these labs. And sometimes things that, because of gain of function research where they try and make viruses function better, some stuff that is like more dangerous than anything in nature exists in these labs. Got to take that very seriously.
Yeah, I'm wondering. So one thing I've heard is that at existing BSL-4 labs, so these like top security biolabs, my impression is that it's like a major hassle to actually work there and like do all of the things, and as a result, like there's some tendency to skimp on the requirements or just like try to argue your way down to BSL-3, or maybe just like fewer people end up working in this kind of line of things you need BSL-4 labs for. So yeah, I'm wondering how harsh you think that trade-off is. And I guess partially like the warm showers thing, for instance, seems like it was partly trying to alleviate the trade-off. Do you have comments there?
I do know it's brutally hard because there's, describing the process people have to go through. Actually, I'm going to quick tangent. I think a lot of the people who work in these labs, when they say, "Oh, it's safe, we don't need additional safety regulations," what they're doing is they have the ground's eye view, which is like, "Wow, we do a lot. Like we are so careful, you can't believe it." Which is true; they're heroically careful. The kind of like bird's eye view of it is that there's been like X number of leaks, and that's way too many from these types of labs. In terms of deterring people, I mean, ideally, it would be you could do ways of doing that were more effective and more pleasant, but I'm not sure. I don't know enough technically of what that trade-off would be. I will say, I think you still need to trade for safety, because the leaks can be so catastrophic. At least safety in the labs where like you're doing gain of function research on something, you have to be so careful because that's you're actually very seriously talking about like tens or hundreds of millions of people being killed potentially. And like you at that scale, like even if it's like for your 8-hour shift, you spend 7 hours getting in and like 1 hour in the lab, like you kind of have to do that.
Yeah, I guess there's some concern that like as a regulator or as the federal government, you can add rules about what people are supposed to do, but at some point compliance seems like it will probably drop off, right?
Yeah. So I think the solution would be, I'm so sorry because I normally don't like this type of process. This is, to be clear, this is like an exception to like how I like the government operating. But like then you maybe just like have the like federal officer hang out in the BSL-4 and like make sure that there's compliance or something. Again, I'm saying like under the circumstances where it's sufficiently dangerous. Ideally, I feel like this is probably a technical problem or largely a technical problem. And because a lot of the standards are very old. So it might be the case that if you had, again, like some bright young scientists, whatever, who are like, okay, how do we do this for real that looks different, is more pleasant, that there might be it might not need to be adversarial, like, or sort of like have that tension. The skimping is a very serious problem. The problem is, though, the rate of lab leaks is too high now. So, yeah, like we can't be okay with it. So you have to do something. And it seems odd to me, or at least counterintuitive off the top of my head, to be like the rate of lab leaks are too high now, so let's like reduce the number of safety precautions so they get lower. It's like, maybe, but it's not obvious.
Okay. To kind of wrap this up. So one thing, maybe I'm going to date this recording and it's going to take a while to get out. But one thing that the world is sort of watching right now is some degree of monkeypox outbreak and spread. Just to make it more concrete, could you give us a sense of like what it would look like in the case of monkeypox? How would your plan interact with that?
So actually, I have not been following monkeypox. So I don't quite know like what scale it's at now.
Yeah. But so my impression is that like it was around a night in I think West African countries probably for a bit. At some point, you start seeing people getting it in like a few different European countries and like Australia and the US. I think it's like reported case numbers are like growing, I think roughly quadratically last time I checked. So it's not like it's not spreading super rapidly, but it like is continuing to spread.
Yeah. I think how fatal is it, or like how serious is it to you?
I don't know I don't actually know.
Yeah, I think it's one of these things where if you have this like thing that's popping up in a lot of different places, and if we do think it's severe, but it spreads slowly, I think most of that can be done with quarantine. And so what you do is and I mean literally quarantine, like you circle out the person's house, or you do, kind of what you did in China, where you just actually take it seriously, and like the friends, neighbors, whatever, can't leave, which is obviously incredibly unpleasant. But if it's important enough, you have to do it. And if you can hold that line. Then it's, wait for the vaccine. And obviously treat people in the meantime, but wait for the vaccine. And then every time something pops up, because you didn't catch them all. You never catch them all. Every time something pops up, you just jump on it. And I think we do have sufficient manpower to do that if we take this seriously. Just, existing first responders and experts. And we do have some of the medical facilities you want for that in the strategic national stockpile. I don't know exactly if we have enough realistically, but they're not, it's funny, they're kind of coy about how many of things they have in the strategic national stockpile because they don't want people to know how prepared they are for different contingencies. I think something like that would be, it's so much easier. It's the fast moving ones that are really hard.
Okay. Cool. And actually this reminds me, one thing I'm kind of surprised you didn't mention was testing. So like one thing, like early on in COVID, like there were restrictions on who could get tested, and like there were these faulty test kits, and like you weren't allowed to test people in other ways. This comes up with monkeypox again, or just I don't know how big an issue it actually is, but I noticed that like so it turns out that if you look at reported cases, something like 99% of them are in men. Basically, it spreads among the community of men who have sex with men. At least reported spread.
Yeah.
And one thing, it occurs to me is, well, if you aren't in that community, do you do you actually get tested? Because like you can't just order a test online and get one yourself, right? You have to be approved to get a test. And it's not obvious to me how like available these tests are. But at the very least in COVID, I think it's like essentially a matter of historical fact that like testing was a big bottleneck.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering like how big a problem do you see that as being, and is that addressed in the Biden pandemic plan, and do you think it should be?
So I think this was under the ubiquitous surveillance component, and I jumped to the like initial finding part just because it's kind of more interesting, and I don't know, it's like new or something to talk about. Whereas there's also to like have facilities in place so you can get like rapid testing, just the basic standard testing kits out, and also that you can get the agents needed to like do the proper tests very quickly, and depending on the thing, that can be absolutely massive. I think actually testing really mattered for COVID. And I think it's hard to, Yeah, I do think that's got to be a huge part of it, because you do kind of want to know it's about having information kind of on the ground. This is why you want to know initially who you have to circle, and this is how you have to find people to, if there are outbreaks elsewhere, to search for. There's these interesting other sort of in between things that people do where they test wastewater.
Yep.
See what's coming out, and this is another thing you can do where if people aren't self-reporting or whatever, you can test wastewater and then move up and test wastewater and move up until you can actually get into a certain block area. I know someone here has this thing, and then again, you can actually just quarantine that. But this is kind of like one of these ubiquitous surveillance testing things. It's a lot like the sort of personal at-home tests.
Sure. And how much of if you wanted to scale up at-home tests, or maybe like doctor's tests, or I don't exactly know, how much of that is a matter of like improving R&D versus like regulatory changes to approve things quicker?
I don't know. I know. So I mentioned before with the testing kits that I think it was the first testing kit that came out was not approved because it was, it was below the efficacy level or the required efficacy level, and that like set us back a really dangerous. Honestly, that decision was like one of those like horrific. Who knows what human tragedy came from that decision things. So they're part of it, but I actually am not sure how hard it is to make these things. Again, for things like scaling, this is where you want they have a term for this. I wish I remember what it was. It's, these centers where you can manufacture on quick turnaround as needed. So, if you do have a test, you can kind of like send these out and like rapidly scale them.
Okay, cool. Is there anything else you'd like to say about pandemic policy? Yeah, and if not, I'll move on to another topic.
I think this is extraordinarily important, like really, really important. And I cannot believe that people aren't taking this more seriously, especially this so close after COVID. And I think it's like morally abhorrent to like allow this thing as bad as COVID or worse to happen again, especially after we know exactly what it looks like and when we can stop it for very little money. It doesn't make any sense at all. And it's the kind of thing like I can't even imagine how you'd explain to like your grandkids, when they're like in some cataclysmic nightmare that, it's like, oh, but, it's $30 billion.
Okay, cool. The next thing I want to talk about is semiconductor manufacturing. It seemed like this was another issue in your campaign that I don't think other candidates talked about as much. So, yeah, I had the impression, correct me that I'm wrong, that you thought it was important to increase domestic either semiconductor manufacturing or like essentially computer chip manufacturing.
Yeah.
Am I right that you think that? And if you do think that, why?
Yeah, I do think that. There's a couple of reasons why. The first reason, I'll go through the first reason, which is more the part that was in my platform, and then I can talk about some other considerations that I think kind of go deeper or like in more directions. One is these jobs are good jobs, and they actually are like the kind of jobs you can get without a college degree. You can have insurance, good pay, like raise a family. My brother got one of these jobs. Now he has more savings than I do. And, before, he's not on the weather, he's not painting houses like he was. So this is like a great way to have the American dream come back. And in particular, in the district where I was running, we're just by Intel and so like the Silicon Force, which has a lot of the semiconductor manufacturing. And this has been such a blessing to sort of our area and our community. And it's one of those things we kind of want to scale up locally. More broadly, I have concerns about the potential use for more advanced semiconductors in various weapons systems. So basically, almost any like next generation weapon system you need requires like very, very advanced computer chips. I'm thinking like hypersonic missiles, like certainly quantum, various quantum uses or technologies. Like there's some of the designs of like next generation fighters. There's these things you really need computer chips for. There's also like potentially like artificial intelligence being used either for like some sort of hacking attack or other things like this that could really get around cybersecurity norms. I think it's the case that we do not want these falling into like Chinese military hands. I think this is necessary for the security of the United States. I think it's necessary for global security, really. And in order to do that, there's a couple different techniques. One is you don't export the manufacturing equipment you use to make semiconductors. So that China actually can't make their own domestically, or they can't make the state-of-the-art ones. It's fine if they make kind of like older generation computer chips. And that means that the manufacturing is going to be done in like the United States mostly, maybe a little bit in South Korea. Actually, Taiwan would be another place, though that's a different problem. Another way to do it is you actually just build the facilities in the United States. So the next generation facilities, there can only be, so the facilities, the fabs to make computer chips, like the next generation ones, cost like tens of billions of dollars. They are incredibly expensive. They contain some of the most sophisticated technology in existence. And because of the size of the market for these chips, you can only have like 2 or 3 of these fabs anywhere. There just isn't enough demand. If you build a fourth, the price would drop low and everyone would lose money. So there's a question of not of like how many are built. It's like, where are they built? Now, if China gets one, that means someone else like can't. But it also means that if U.S. keeps getting a lot of these, we're sort of like starving out China from being like able to get like a viable industry going. Now, I'm not saying China shouldn't get chips. I think actually they definitely should get chips. Consumer electronics, just like the normal things. What you really want is to have control of them so the military is not getting them. And if there's any, shenanigans happening past that, in terms of being passed on, you just cut off the chips.
Okay.
And you can only cut off the chips if you control them. There's this thing that happened. This is such a good example of the problem. China's trying to build a supercomputer. Intel asked for a license from the U.S. government to export some amazing amount of, $800 million worth of computer chips for this thing. Again, not the number, it's something like that. And the U.S. said, no, it's a security risk. So China had a local fab use all the equipment it had bought from the United States to make the chips. And then they were like $800 million richer and $800 million more experienced. And again, we'd given the equipment to do it. So I think like preempting the equipment is like a huge part of this.
Okay. I guess, let's go through that in order. So firstly, like when you say like there are good jobs at these plants, what job is this? Literally what are the jobs, and like what should I imagine someone doing all day in these? I actually have no idea.
Yeah, so the job my brother had was he did vacuum and abatement units. So these were the pipes that moved chemicals in and out for the manufacturing process.
Okay.
Abatement means like the place where you burn it, so like you get rid of its toxic properties. And what that actually looks like is you have like the production floor, which you imagine like a factory,
Sure.
And then below it in sort of like a basement level, there's all these pipes running these things around. So he like kept them. He brought in like the new units that could do the pumps better. He fixed the pumps when they were broken. He like kept the piping up to date. It was sort of like it's working at a factory basically, and there's a lot of these jobs. I think obviously there's like some Intel design jobs, but there's so many jobs that just keeping the machines running, keeping the place sealed, keeping the place clean. Because again, these things are you have to keep the clean room so clean. When you have $100 billion worth of equipment, you hire a lot of people for everything to make sure it's just absolutely perfect. If you have some knobs off by some tiny fraction of a percent, you can destroy millions of dollars of chips very easily. I'd say the mental image I would try and get is like factory type jobs.
Okay. So it basically sounds like I should be imagining like precision plumbing, or like, the highly precise version of being a mechanic.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Okay, cool. The next thing is, it seems like Oregon District 6 in particular was like a good place to have these or something. Just, can you say more? Like, it sounded like Intel was there, and therefore that's why stuff was. Is there something about Oregon that makes it like good for this, or did Intel just happen to be there?
I'm not sure if it happened to be there. I think some time way back in the past they like decided on this place because of its like seismic properties or something, and being close enough to supply chains. I'm just making this up, but like there's something that did it. But once they had
Oregon not great for site.
So Oregon is this is a different problem in Oregon. Oregon is amazing for seismic things, except that there's a plate that's going to slip at some point, probably in the next 150 years, and going to have like the most, or at least like an 8.7 earthquake that'll destroy everything.
Okay.
It's going to be terrible. Something like it's supposed to bring a tsunami that'll like destroy the following towns, and like a liquefaction of most of downtown Portland, and it's like a whole nightmare scenario. Right. So in California, they have these little earthquakes. You guys have the little earthquakes all the time. Yep. Oregon, we just save up.
Oh, okay. All right, that makes sense. So seismic properties maybe was one reason.
Yeah. Though someday they might lose a lot of money to the seismic properties. But once it was there's also like, I think there were some other original semiconductor companies there, and they just had like it's a bit like Silicon Valley, just have like a little community.
Sure.
But Intel's continued to like build its fabs there, so it has its all of its like state of the art fabs, right there in Oregon. And then once it's one of these things where once you have all the experts in one place and then and then have their kids in school and stuff, like it's worth coming back and having other to continue building there.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's an especially good place.
All right.
Cool.
Cool.
And also Oregon's amazing, right? Like, why would you live anywhere else?
Well, I've actually never visited, but
it's actually really nice. Yeah.
Okay.
Sixth District is gorgeous. We've got like the Cascade Range, which is like beautiful evergreen forest. We got down to this like wine country with all these like vineyards and stuff. Willamette Valley, which is like that's what you think of like the pristine valley. It's like really nice.
Okay, cool. Yeah, maybe I'll go someday. So yeah, but it seemed like a big thing was the use of these things in like weapon systems and like for national security. Yeah, so could you give me a sense of just like what the status quo is of like where chips are currently being produced, like absent further policy to change that?
Yeah, so currently the U.S. produces some, but we've been producing fewer through time, so we're actually kind of like working our way out of the market. There's like some produced in Ireland, there's some produced in Israel. The place that produces like most of the really state-of-the-art chips is Taiwan. It's like the main player. The other place that makes really good state-of-the-art chips is like Samsung in South Korea. China's like it was one of its kind of national goals, pronounces these things to have bring semiconductor manufacturing, and it's got a company SMIC that is pretty good at like the higher node levels, and they keep buying more and more sophisticated equipment. And they've gone down to, so what they do is like their main manufacturing is kind of like older generations of chips. And they have like a very small capacity of like it's not quite state of the art, but like one generation behind chips that they're kind of experimenting on to like learn the techniques. And they're closing the gap. They've always been closing the gap in terms of like the generations. And they ordered, all right, so there's one piece of machinery that's used for like the state of the art chips. It's like, how expensive is it? I can't believe I forgot this. It's extraordinarily expensive, very sensitive. It's like an ultraviolet lithography machine. I'm going to say $150 million, but I don't remember exactly. And they ordered these, and that could make you down to like actually several generations that don't even exist yet, because you can't project out where we'll be. And that would put them, in a place where they could even get ahead of the U.S. And they ordered it. They were kind of on their way, and then there was a last-minute intervention, and the license to export it from the Netherlands, where they built, was withdrawn. Thankfully, because that would have been absolutely terrible.
Okay. And if I'm thinking about like it seems like there are two goals you could have. Like goal one is like increase U.S. production capacity so that like the U.S. is self-reliant, or like imports can't be cut off because like it's all in Oregon and somewhere else. And I can kind of understand like how that could happen. Build like a couple. How many factories can you need? I don't know, but presumably only so many. But I guess a second goal it sounds like you might have is just be such a big portion of the market that like you can cut other countries off if like you really want to do that. Is that like achievable?
So I think if you're big enough, if you were a big enough percent of the market. So if the U.S. if there's only room for 3 fabs, and we build the third, and China like builds a fourth, the cost of the chips will plummet to the point where like everyone lost money. And that's maybe China might want to do that and just subsidize it, but these things are so expensive that I think it's probably the case that if like we're kind of at market price, and you're going to build this like $20 billion thing that's just going to lose a bunch of money, like the appetite's not going to be there. Especially if like people are fighting you, not shipping you the manufacturing equipment you want, and like it's kind of like just making it harder to the point where they say, "Screw it, we'll just buy our chips."
And so you're imagining a world where like like China can't. Are we mostly thinking China, or like any other?
Mostly thinking China. Yeah.
Okay, and are you imagining a world where like some kind of war is going on, and therefore they can't easily import them from like the Netherlands or like South Korea or Taiwan?
I'm actually imagining that there isn't a war going on, because what happened was when they started, kind of ringing the bells of war, everyone cut their chips off.
Okay.
And honestly, you even need the chips just like in your tanks and planes. Like you can, these things are so central to so many technologies now. And if you try to go to like a technology that doesn't have these chips, you're just going to get destroyed, because the U.S. is like, South Korea, like, these have some very serious militaries. So the idea is like not to help in war, it's to make it so that China is not strong enough that it thinks it can go to war.
Okay.
Or even like you have one thing that's like a full scale war. You also have other things, which is like escalating cyber attacks or something, which could be like, economically devastating, but aren't quite war and maybe don't escalate all the way to war. But if we could just make them not happen, it'd be so much better.
Okay. And does that, like, if there are multiple countries involved, it seems like involved in the production of these chips, it seems like, you would need to get like some sort of agreement to kind of cut the supply off.
Yeah.
How viable is that?
I think if it were the case that China looked like it was sort of gearing up for war, Taiwan is going to be extremely ready to cut off chips and to cooperate with the U.S. in any way it can. And South Korea, again, with the menacing, is going to be extremely keen to like cooperate with the U.S. in any way it can. So I think if the more militant it gets, the more dangerous it gets, the more you would sort of like get solidarity on this.
Okay. And does that require? Sorry, now that I'm thinking about it, if Taiwan and South Korea are like mostly, allied with the U.S., like, does the U.S. need to ratchet up domestic manufacturing, or like because it seems like if we really need stuff, South Korea will make it for us.
I think South Korea, it's good if South Korea also makes it for us, or like makes the stuff and puts it in the phones and we get the phones, this sort of thing. Same with Taiwan. Like currently Taiwan makes most of the stuff that we use. The ratcheting up in the U.S. has a couple of advantages. One, you're talking about, it's again, self-sufficiency. Another is like, again, these are good jobs and we kind of need good jobs back because that sort of stopped existing. And then the third would be just, again, drowning out the market, which is, Taiwan's not going to make more fabs. South Korea is not. And I think we can support 3 fabs now at this node.
Okay. All right. So in terms of like the sense that it would be desirable to like produce more semiconductors or semiconductor chips in Oregon, what would the federal government actually do to make that happen?
It's already done some things with it had the CHIPS Act and a couple other acts. I actually wrote some of the bills that were behind the reshoring, because there's been a reshoring process. I actually was very lucky to be able to write some sections of this and like help reshore these fabs. Honestly, what it is a lot of it's the subsidies and like financial incentives that does it. There's something that I wish they'd done is sort of push the states or like other places to be more accommodating. There was this is one of those terrible things. There was a land use issue in Oregon over they wouldn't like rezone an area. It was just farmland. It was like they wouldn't rezone some farmland. And so the fab that's like a $20 billion fab that moved to Ohio, which I assume is like a less favorable place. So I think we also just like hurt our semiconductor industry as well as, I think it's not desirable for a lot of reasons. So I think, trying to, stay involved in this and sort of like maneuver it or like help, push it into fruition would be good.
Okay. How much, in terms of land use stuff, how much can the federal government do about that?
I think what the federal government does about other things like that, and didn't do in this case, obviously, is it sort of it gives out various like forms of aid and like assistance, and it can also like shame people. And I think if you're saying like give them the space, it might work. You can have it's just like be an influence thing. It might be that wouldn't work because obviously like land use is a local issue, but I think you can kind of encourage people one way or another. Fortunately, it did at least move to Ohio. If it was a case where like they couldn't land it somewhere, I think it would make sense for the U.S. to like, or like the federal government to come in like ready to, roll up its sleeves, ready to like make sure that we were going to get our fab built.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's all my questions on pandemic policy and semiconductor manufacturing. I'm wondering, so I don't know, you spent some time in this campaign, you did quite a few interviews. Is there anything other than those that like you wish you had talked more about, or you wish people had asked you more questions about?
It's a really good question. Actually, people didn't really ask that many questions about those things, so I wish they'd ask more questions about those things.
Yeah, actually, that's part of why I noticed that I had gone through this campaign, and I was like, oh, I can't find any interviews where someone asked, what is this pandemic policy and why would it work?
Yeah.
Which seems like things I would want to know.
Yep. I have to say, while we're talking about things, lessons from the campaign, I did not come out especially impressed with a lot of media outlets. I'm going to be vague so that I'm like not calling everyone out, but like there were
some were good.
there were some good ones.
Yeah, I remember listening to some interviews. It was really sad. There was this one interview you did with, I think it was called Oregon Live 360, where I was like, I like really liked that interview, and then I guess that produced this like unfavorable soundbite for you.
And then like all hell broke loose.
Yeah.
I like that one too. I think it was actually my best interview at the time.
Yeah. Well, it was. If the only point of the campaign was to impress me, then the
yeah.
But yeah, are there any other questions that you wish people would ask more?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I think this has been very thorough and very pleasant.
Okay. And yeah, I guess on my end, is there anything that I haven't asked that you'd like to get out there? Maybe now the campaign's over, or to this audience or something.
It depends who the audience is exactly, but I would say vote for Andrea Salinas, donate to her. It still might be a tight race, and we need to make sure that Oregon stays blue.
Okay, cool. Actually, yeah. Speaking of that, have you had a chat to Andrea Salinas post the race?
We're texting buddies. We text back and forth.
Okay, cool.
I'm trying to arrange for legal reasons. My campaign is like a legal entity, kind of needs to wind down, but then I'm hoping to jump in and help with. Obviously, I'm going to max out my campaign contribution. I'm going to try and knock on doors, see what I can do to help. But yeah, I haven't quite gotten there yet.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I guess the final question I want to ask is if people are interested in hearing more from you about stuff in general, how should people do that?
I love to talk to people. So if you're around and I bump into you, that'd be great. I will probably be attending Effective Altruism Global. Again, you're talking about people who are enthusiastic about effective altruism have been very enthusiastic about my campaign, and I've become very, I'm very enthusiastic about them and them, seeing if we can bring this sort of effectiveness mindset to politics. So I'll be at those things. You can email me, crmflynn@gmail.com. I will not always answer, especially if there's a lot of emails, but
okay. Great. Well, thanks for showing up and answering questions.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.